the war that was supposed to continue. By the summer of 1945, the world believed the war was ending. In Europe, it already had. Berlin was rubble. Nazi banners lay torn and trampled in the streets. Hitler was dead, his empire erased in smoke and concrete. Allied soldiers celebrated. Families reunited, and newspapers printed the word victory in letters tall enough to fill a man's hands. But across the Pacific, victory was an illusion. The war against Japan was not slowing. It was hardening. From Washington to Pearl Harbor, military planners stared at maps that told a grim story. The Japanese empire was wounded, strangled by blockade, battered by bombing, but it was not broken. Its armies still fought with ferocity that defied logic. Its pilots still flew suicide missions. Its soldiers still refused to surrender, even when surrounded, starving, and hopelessly outgunned. Every island taken had become a graveyard. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, names that no longer represented places, but body counts. On Okinawa alone, more than 12,000 Americans were killed. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000. Civilians, men, women, children, were caught in the middle, coerced, trapped, or driven to suicide by propaganda that promised torture and dishonor if they surrendered. And still Japan fought on. That reality terrified Allied leadership, because Okinawa was not Japan. It was a preview. If Japanese forces fought this way on distant islands, what would happen when Allied troops set foot on the home island themselves, where every village could become a fortress, where civilians were being trained to resist with bamboo spears, explosives, and bare hands, where surrender was viewed not as defeat, but as spiritual annihilation? In briefing rooms, one word began to dominate every conversation: invasion. It had a name: Operation Downfall, the largest amphibious assault ever conceived, larger than Normandy, larger than anything in human history. A two-phase invasion designed to smash through Japan's southern defenses, then drive directly toward Tokyo itself. Millions of Allied soldiers would be involved. Millions. And no one believed they would come back unscathed. Casualty estimates varied wildly, because the truth was too terrible to quantify. Conservative projections spoke of hundreds of thousands of Americans dead. Others warned the number could reach 1 million casualties, or more. Japanese losses were expected to be catastrophic. Millions, including civilians. The invasion planners were not optimists. They were realists. They studied, captured documents, intercepted communications, battlefield behavior. They knew the enemy they were facing. Japan was preparing not for victory, but for mutual destruction, and the clock was ticking. Every week the war continued meant more Allied prisoners executed, more cities burned, more young men were shipped across the ocean with no clear end in sight. Public patience at home was wearing thin. Soldiers who had already fought for years wondered if they would ever see peace, or if they would die storming beaches no one had ever heard of. President Harry S. Truman, new to office, found himself trapped inside this nightmare. He did not inherit a clean ending to the war. He inherited a choice between horrors: invade Japan and sacrifice a generation, starve into submission and watch millions die slowly, or find another way. What the public did not know, what even many military leaders did not fully grasp, was that plans of invasion were already moving forward. Landing dates selected, divisions assigned, medals ordered in advance. Yes, medals. So many Purple Hearts were manufactured for the invasion of Japan that the surplus would last the United States military for decades. The war was supposed to be over. Instead, it was preparing to become something far worse. And if history had taken just one different turn, the beaches of Japan would run red with blood the world had never seen before. Operation Downfall, the plan to invade Japan. Operation Downfall was not a threat. It was not speculation. It was a plan already in motion. By mid-1945, Allied commanders had accepted a brutal truth. Japan was not going to surrender voluntarily. The island-hopping campaign had proven one thing beyond doubt. Japanese forces would fight until annihilation. They would not collapse. They would not break. And they would not negotiate on Allied terms. So the United States was prepared to do what had never been done before: invade Japan itself. Operation Downfall was divided into two colossal phases. The first was Operation Olympic. Scheduled for November 1st, 1945, Olympic would target the southern island of Kyushu. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops would storm beaches defended by entrenched Japanese forces, airfield, artillery, and suicide units. The goal was to seize staging areas for the second and far deadlier phase of the invasion. That phase was called Operation Coronet. Planned for spring 1946, Coronet envisioned a direct assault on the Kano Plain near Tokyo. This was the heart of Japan. It's the political center. It's the industrial core. It's the population densest and most fanatically prepared. If Olympic was hell, Coronet was annihilation. The scale was staggering. Over 5 million Allied troops would eventually be committed. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft. Every lesson learned from Normandy, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa applied at once, but magnified beyond precedent. And Japan knew it was coming. That was the most terrifying part. Japanese intelligence had correctly deduced Kyushu as the likely landing site. In response, they poured everything they had into its defense. By the summer of 1945, Japan had stationed over 900,000 troops on Kyushu alone, nearly triple Allied estimates. Caves were dug into mountainsides. Artillery was concealed underground. Airfields were camouflaged. And most chilling of all, Japan prepared civilians. Men too old to fight and boys too young to enlist were organized into militia units. Women were trained to charge tanks with explosives. School children practiced attacks with bamboo spears. The message was simple and absolute. Every Japanese citizen was a soldier. This was not defense. It was a national suicide doctrine. The Japanese military called it Ketsugo, the decisive battle. They believed that if they inflicted enough casualties during the invasion, the United States might abandon unconditional surrender and negotiate a settlement that preserved the emperor and Japan's military honor. To do that, they were willing to burn the nation to the ground. American planners understood this mindset all too well. They had seen it on every island. Soldiers who charged machine guns rather than retreat. Pilots who turned aircraft into guided missiles. Units that fought to the last man, even when defeat was absolute. Now imagine that mentality multiplied across an entire country. Casualty estimates grew darker with every revised report. Some studies predicted 250,000 Americans would die. Others warned of 500,000. A few whispered numbers so high they were rarely written down. Japanese losses were expected to reach into the millions, soldiers and civilians alike. General Douglas MacArthur believed the invasion was necessary and survivable. Others were not so sure. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, later called it a war of extermination. The Navy worried about kamikaze attacks on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of aircraft, many obsolete, many barely flyable, were being stockpiled for suicide missions. One pilot, one plane, one ship destroyed. Again, and again, and again. As the invasion plan solidified, a quiet but ominous signal emerged of just how grim the future looked. The U.S. military began producing Purple Heart medals in vast quantities, anticipating casualties on a scale never before seen. So many were made that even today, decades later, some of those medals are still awarded. The invasion of Japan was not a battle waiting to be fought. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. And while millions prepared to march into that fire, a different solution was nearing completion, one that promised to end the war without an invasion, or end far more than just a war. A nation prepared to die. Inside Japan, 1945 did not feel like defeat. It felt like preparation. Cities lay in ruins from months of firebombing. Tokyo had burned so completely that entire neighborhoods no longer existed on maps. Food was scarce. Fuel was rationed. Transportation barely functioned. And yet, Japan did not surrender. The reason was not ignorance. It was a belief. For decades, the Japanese state had cultivated a doctrine where surrender was worse than death. The emperor was divine. The nation was sacred. To yield was not just a military failure. It was a moral collapse, a betrayal of history itself. By the summer of 1945, this ideology had reached its most dangerous form. The Japanese military no longer planned to win the war. It was planned to make victory too costly for the enemy. This was Ketsugo, the strategy of decisive sacrifice. High command accepted that Japan could not stop the United States at sea or in the air. What it could do was bleed them on land, every beach, every village, every mountain pass. The goal was simple: force the Americans to pay such a horrific price that they would negotiate. Honor would be preserved. The emperor would remain. Japan would survive, broken but unbeaten in spirit. To achieve this, the line between soldier and civilian was erased. Entire populations were mobilized. Elderly men drilled with outdated rifles. Teenagers were given explosives and instructed on how to throw themselves beneath tanks. Women were trained to charge with bamboo spears sharpened to crude points. Even children were prepared. School textbooks were replaced with manuals on resistance. Teachers taught students how to die for the nation. The final lesson was always the same: you do not surrender. The Japanese army stockpiled weapons not for victory, but for mass resistance. Caves became fortresses. Cities became kill zones. Mountains became death traps. Every Allied step inland was meant to cost blood. The air was no safer. Thousands of aircraft, many barely functional, were reserved for kamikaze attacks. Pilots were trained quickly, solemnly, and without illusion. They wrote farewell letters, drank ceremonial sake, took off knowing they would never land. In Okinawa, these tactics had already shown their power. Over 1,500 kamikaze aircraft had struck Allied fleets. Ships burned, crews drowned, survivors carried scars that never healed. And Okinawa was only a fraction of what Japan planned for the home islands. American intelligence intercepted fragments of this plan. What they read chilled them. Japan was not preparing for a conventional defense. It was prepared for national extinction, if necessary. Within Japan's leadership, however, unity was cracking. The Supreme War Council was split down the middle. Half believed surrender was inevitable. Half believed surrender was dishonor worse than annihilation. Meetings ended without decisions. Arguments went in circles. Time bled away. Even after Hiroshima, some still doubted. Was it truly a single bomb? Was it exaggerated? Could it be replicated? No one knew. And in Japanese culture, hesitation was fatal. Meanwhile, the emperor remained distant, silent, almost mythic. His word could end the war, but tradition bound him. He was not meant to interfere directly. And so the machinery of destruction continued to grind forward. Every day, the war dragged on meant more dead, more burned cities, more starving civilians, more prisoners executed. Yet the system could not stop itself. The United States watched this unfold with mounting dread. Invasion meant slaughter. Bombing meant suffering. Blockade meant slow death. There were no clean solutions, only faster ones. And in the background, hidden from public view, guarded by secrecy and steel, a weapon waited. One designed not to defeat an army, but to shatter a nation's will in a single moment. The question was no longer whether Japan would fight to the end. The question was whether the world was prepared to end the fight for them. The weapon that changed the equation. Far from burning cities and dying armies, the most important battlefield of 1945 was silent. No gunfire, no marching troops, no flags, only laboratories, deserts, and guarded airfields, sealed behind layers of secrecy so deep that even many senior Allied commanders did not fully understand what was being built. It was called the Manhattan Project. The name meant nothing. That was the point. Spread across Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, more than 130,000 people worked in isolation. Engineers, physicists, machinists, guards, most unaware of the project's true purpose. They lived under assumed names. Letters were censored. Conversations were monitored. Silence was enforced as strictly as discipline on the front lines. What they were creating was not simply a new bomb. It was a new category of power. For the first time in history, a weapon would draw energy not from chemicals or fire, but from the atom itself. Matter would be torn apart. Energy released in a chain reaction so violent it defied imagination. A single device could do what thousands of bombers could not: erase a city in seconds. Some scientists believed it would end the war instantly. Others feared it might end everything. At Los Alamos, Robert Oppenheimer watched equations become reality. He understood the theory. He understood the risks. And he understood the implications better than almost anyone alive. They were not just building a weapon. They were unlocking a door humanity had never opened before. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the world crossed that threshold. At 5 hours, 29 minutes, and 45 seconds, the Trinity test detonated. The explosion turned night into an artificial sunrise. Heat washed across the desert. Observers miles away felt it on their skin. A towering column of fire and smoke climbed into the sky, forming a shape no one had ever seen before. A mushroom cloud. Silence followed. Then awe. Then fear. One scientist laughed. Another wept. Oppenheimer recalled words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb worked. There was no longer any doubt. When President Harry S. Truman was informed at the Potsdam Conference, his reaction was restrained, but decisive. He now possessed what he later called the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. But possession demanded choice. Germany was already defeated. The original justification, to stop Hitler, was gone. What remained was Japan. And Japan refused to surrender. The Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, warning Japan of prompt and utter destruction if it did not yield. No mention of the atomic bomb, just a final chance. Japan's response was silence. Whether through internal division, disbelief, or defiance, the message went unanswered. Behind closed doors, debates raged. Could a demonstration work? What if it failed? What if Japan still refused? What if an invasion killed millions? The clock was ticking. American forces were already preparing Operation Downfall. Purple Heart medals were being manufactured in staggering quantities, so many that they would supply casualties for decades beyond the war. The atomic bomb offered something no other option could: speed. One strike. Possibly two. A shock so overwhelming that resistance might collapse instantly. Not a battle. An ending. Targets were selected carefully. Cities that had been spared firebombing. To measure the weapon's effect clearly: Hiroshima, Kakura, Nagasaki. Crews were trained without being told exactly what they would carry. The bomb itself was given a name almost grotesque in its innocence: Little Boy. By late July, the weapon was shipped to the Pacific, loaded onto a B-29 bomber on the island of Tinian. The crew climbed aboard. Engines warmed. History moved forward. The decision was no longer theoretical, no longer academic, no longer reversible. In a matter of days, the world would learn what it meant to split the atom in war. And once the sun fell from the sky, there would be no going back. The day the sun fell, August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. Hiroshima, Japan. The morning was ordinary. Streetcars rattled along their tracks. Shopkeepers swept doorways. Children walked to school beneath a clear summer sky. After months of air raid warnings that rarely ended in bombing, the city had learned a dangerous habit: calm. Then a single aircraft appeared, high above Hiroshima, far higher than any bomber usually flew. A lone B-29 Superfortress glinted in the sunlight. No fighter escorts. No formation. No sirens. To many below, it barely seemed worth noticing. Its name was painted on the fuselage in neat letters: Enola Gay. Inside were 12 American airmen, trained, disciplined, and tense. They carried no sense of triumph, only procedure. None of them could see the city clearly from 31,000 feet. None could imagine what would happen next. At precisely 8:15, the bomb bay doors opened. What fell was not large by conventional standards. No roar, no flame, no warning. 4:43 seconds. The bomb dropped silently toward the heart of Hiroshima. Then the world changed. A flash brighter than the sun erupted over the city. Pure white, absolute, merciless. In an instant, Temperatures near the blast reached several thousand degrees. Stone ignited. Steel softened. Human beings vanished where they stood. Shadows burned into walls. People ceased to exist, leaving only outlines etched into concrete. The shockwave followed faster than thought. Buildings collapsed like paper models. Roofs lifted and shattered. Glass turned into airborne knives. Fires ignited everywhere at once, merging into a single, unstoppable inferno. In less than a heartbeat, a city of 350,000 was destroyed. Those closest to the blast were vaporized instantly. Those farther away survived, briefly. Skin hung from arms like torn fabric. Eyes were blinded by the flash. People wandered through the ruins in silence, too shocked even to scream. Rivers filled with the injured seeking relief from the heat, only to die together in the water. Above it all, a column of smoke and debris rose into the sky. The mushroom cloud climbed mile after mile, carrying ash, metal, wood, and human remains into the upper atmosphere. From the Enola Gay, the crew stared in stunned silence. One man whispered, "My God!" on the ground. No one understood what had happened. There was no language for it. Hospitals had been destroyed. Doctors were dead or wounded. Survivors tried to help one another with bare hands and scraps of cloth. Those who appeared unharmed began collapsing hours later, vomiting, bleeding, burning from the inside. An invisible killer had entered the war. Radiation sickness spread without warning. Hair fell out in clumps. Skin darkened. Wounds refused to heal. Entire families who survived the blast died days or weeks later, confused and terrified by an illness no one could treat. By nightfall, fires still burned across Hiroshima. Tens of thousands were already dead. Communication with Tokyo was severed. When reconnaissance teams finally reached the city, even hardened military officers struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction. One bomb, one plane, one city erased. Yet in Tokyo, disbelief reigned. Some leaders argued the devastation was exaggerated. Others insisted it must have been a massive conventional raid. Even if it was a new weapon, they said surrender would dishonor the nation. The military faction still held power, still believed endurance could force better terms, still believed Japan could fight on. So Japan did not surrender. As radioactive ash drifted eastward across the countryside, another bomb was already being prepared. The first strike had shattered a city. The second would shatter denial itself. The world stood at the edge of something irreversible, and it was about to fall again. The second strike, and the world that followed. August 9th, 1945. 3 days after Hiroshima. The world had not yet absorbed the first catastrophe, when history accelerated again. At dawn, on the remote Pacific island of Tinian, another B-29 Superfortress rolled down the runway. Its engines roared into the humid air, lifting the aircraft slowly, heavily, toward the sky. Painted on its nose was a name few would remember, but history would never forget: Bockscar. In its bomb bay rested Fat Man, a plutonium weapon more complex, more powerful, and more unpredictable than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The target was Kokura, a Japanese industrial city dense with factories and arsenals. This time, Japan was alert. Air defenses scanned the skies. Cities braced for attack. Hiroshima was no longer a rumor, but it was still incomprehensible. No one truly believed it could happen again. Over Kokura, clouds rolled in thick and unyielding. Smoke from an earlier firebombing obscured the aiming point. The crew circled once. Then again, fuel gauges dropped. Anti-aircraft fire climbed toward the aircraft in black. Useless bursts far below. The mission was failing. With fuel running dangerously low, the order was given to divert. The bomber turned south toward its secondary target. Nagasaki. Nestled between steep hills, Nagasaki was an industrial city of shipyards, factories, and workers' homes. Clouds still covered much of the area, but then, briefly, a gap opened. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb was released. The explosion detonated slightly off target, sparing parts of the city, but what it struck was obliterated. The surrounding hills compressed the blast inward, focusing its force like a clenched fist. Steel twisted. Concrete disintegrated. Entire neighborhoods vanished in an instant. Tens of thousands died immediately. Survivors staggered through ruins already coated in radioactive ash, unaware that the air itself had become lethal. Fires raged again. Hospitals collapsed again. Suffering repeated itself. New city, same silence, same confusion. 2 cities destroyed. 2 bombs. 6 days. Inside Japan's leadership, chaos erupted. The Supreme War Council met in emergency session. The facts were now undeniable. This was not a single weapon. The United States possessed the ability to erase city after city, without invasion, without warning, without limit. Still, the council deadlocked. Half argued for surrender. Half demanded continued resistance. Honor clashed with survival. Then something unprecedented happened. For the first time in modern Japanese history, Emperor Hirohito intervened directly. Quietly, calmly, he broke the tie. He acknowledged the new and most cruel bomb and declared that continuing the war would mean the annihilation of the Japanese nation itself. Even then, the war nearly continued. Hardline officers attempted a coup. They tried to seize the imperial palace. They tried to destroy the surrender recording. Shots were fired in the darkness. Loyal guards resisted. By morning, the coup collapsed. On August 15th, 1945, the emperor's voice reached the Japanese people over radio waves, soft, formal, restrained. He did not say the word surrender, but everyone understood. The war was over. Across the world, church bells rang. Crowds flooded streets from New York to London to San Francisco. Sailors celebrated on ship decks. Soldiers finally believed they would go home. World War II had ended, but the world that emerged was not the same one that had entered it. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the suffering continued long after the fires died. Survivors fell ill weeks later. Hair fell out. Wounds refused to heal. Children weakened. Doctors had no explanation. Radiation sickness, an enemy never before faced, claimed lives long after the bombs fell. Globally, leaders studied the photographs. Cities flattened not by armies, but by physics. War had changed forever. Within years, other nations built their own bombs. Bigger ones. Faster ones. Weapons capable of ending civilization many times over. The Cold War was born not from borders or speeches, but from fear. Fear of buttons. Fear of miscalculation. Fear that the next war would not end with surrender, but with silence. And yet, the bomb has not been used in war since. Decades have passed beneath its shadow. The atomic endgame ended World War II in fire and silence, but opened an age where humanity must live with a terrible question. Now that we can destroy everything, will we choose not to?